Hello and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lizzie and today we are doing one of my favorite cozy hobbies. We are going to be doing some embroidery and specifically we are going to be embroidering a pair of my distressed jeans. Okay, to jump right in, here are the distressed jeans I'll be working on. The rip in the center is what I'm going to be embroidering around, so I'm going to take my 8-inch embroidery hoop and split it apart from the inner and outer, slip the inner hoop inside the jeans around the rip that I want to embroider. I'll take the outer hoop, open it up a little bit using the clip and make sure it's nicely centered around the inner hoop. Then I'll go ahead and tighten it down. Now it's time to transfer my design onto the jeans themselves. Here's an inspiration photo of the sort of vibes I'm trying to go for with this design. I want it to be lots of florals and mainly be different shades of green and creams and white. So I have a mock-up of this on my iPad, but I'm just drawing this over using a sharpie directly on the jeans. So we are starting with this dark green embroidery floss and I'm going to take about 20-ish inches off the bobbin here and cut it. Then I'm going to tie a knot in one end as close as I can to the end of this embroidery floss as possible, and then I'm going to create a double knot, trying to put the knots right on top of each other. On the opposite end of the knot I just tied, I'm going to go ahead and thread a needle, and as you can see it's not always the easiest process, but luckily I can quickly fix this by just grabbing that last little thread through. So just to reiterate, I have the needle threaded through on one end of this embroidery floss and the double knot on the other. And that's how I'll set up all my threads for all the stitches in this project. Okay, and now we can start stitching. So I'm gonna take these jeans and put my thread through the underside of them or the inside of them. And then I'm going to push the needle through where I want to create the stitch. As you can see, it can be sort of a lot of guesswork when you're pushing that needle through, trying to get it exactly where you want. Then I'll pull it all the way through until it's tight, and then I'm going to push the needle in where I want to create that stitch. Then I'll pull it tight, and we have our first stitch done. And honestly, it's very simple. We're going to be repeating that process over and over again to create the stems of this flower. So this flower, I'm really aiming to create a sort of baby's breath look here. And so like I said, we're going to be doing back stitching for the stems, and then for the leaves they'll be a little bit different, but not too complicated. So for the leaves with this flower, I'm going to create them using a lazy daisy stitch. And to give a quick run through of that, I'm going to pull the thread through at the base of the leaf and then push the needle in very close to where the thread came out, and then I'm not going to pull the thread all the way through. Instead, I'm going to push my needle up at that point of the leaf and loop that remaining floss around it, and then I'll pull it tight and that creates that nice loop, and to pin it down I'll create a tiny stitch at the point of the leaf. Alright, it may not look like it, but we're actually done with the stem and leaves for this flower, so I'm going to go ahead and tie it off. And so what that looks like, this is just how I do things. I like to just create a knot and pull it tight and as close to whatever I'm embroidering as possible. And I'm just going to hold it in place and pull it through. And then you can see that tiny knot, it's very close, and that's exactly what we want. And then I'll just trim off that extra thread and we're done. So now I can start on the flowers of this baby's breath flower. And so I'm going to use a bright white floss here, and again we're doing that same process of creating a double knot on one end of our embroidery floss, and then we'll thread the needle through the other. I'm also going to trim the excess of that little knot right there, and that's just to prevent any pull through of those little threads as we're creating these French knots. So to create a French knot, I'm going to start by winding my embroidery floss around my needle and pushing it in very close to where we pulled that thread out of. So that should be relatively on top of each other but not directly. And then we're going to pull it through, keeping the thread tight to help create a nice clean knot. As you can see, the distress from these jeans is getting caught, which will happen quite a bit during this project, just a heads up. One thing I wanted to note is that when you're creating these French knots, the more you wrap the thread around your needle before pushing through, the larger the knot will be, and vice versa. For most of these flowers, I'm only wrapping it twice. And just like that, we are on to our next flower. So I'm trying to choose the color I want the stems to be and ultimately choose this bit of a darker green. I felt like it went better with the dark green we've already used. So again, I'm just doing some back stitching here to create the stems, but for these flowers we are trying to create tulips. So for the leaves of these flowers, I'm doing a sort of modified leaf stitch where I start with the same center stitch but bring it down almost all the way touching the stem, and then on either side of that we're going to bring those to the same place and create that sort of leaf pattern, but we're only doing 3 stitches and we want it to look like a sort of long leaf. As I mentioned, a lot of these flowers are going to be different shades of white and cream, and for these tulips I chose a cream color. To create these flowers, I started by creating 3 stitches with where I wanted each petal of the flower to be, and then I'm doing a lazy daisy stitch over the top of that straight thread that I created. And as you can see, it sort of makes this filled in lazy daisy stitch that's pretty simple and easy to repeat. So again, I'm doing a lazy daisy stitch here where I pull through and then push my needle very close to where we pulled our thread out. And then we're not going to pull the thread all the way through, we're going to leave some slack. Push our needle at the top of that thread, the straight one, and we're going to create that loop over the top of it, and then we're going to pull that tight to create that filled in petal look. And then of course, to finish the lazy daisy stitch, we'll create that tiny stitch at the tip of our petal here. So that brings us to our next flower, which we're going to use this darker cream color, and we are going to be creating roses. So roses are a pretty well-known embroidery stitch, so if you're not interested in the run-through, go ahead and skip ahead. But to explain it a little bit, we are going to start by creating a 5-point X or 5-point star or flower, whatever you want to think of it as. And here I just have 4-point stars. I think that was just easier for me to draw when I was putting the design on my jeans here. I'm just going to create 5, and it's important to have an odd number when you're creating these roses because you're going to be doing that weaving pattern where you're skipping one, and so you can't do that with an even number. So I'm going to pull that thread through once I have my 5-point star, and I'm going to slide my needle underneath one of these threads and over another. So I'm going to go over one and then under the next and over one and under the next to, like I said, create that weaving pattern that will then give you your rose. And so you're basically going around this star and you're going over and under and over and under, and that creates that design. And sometimes your thread gets all messed up and caught up and you have to go in and rethread your needle and make sure all the threads are nice and straight. And even though I've done this for a while, that still does happen to me, and I just wanted to include it to sort of normalize it. So as you can see, the closer we get to the edge of this rose, the harder it is to go around and continue that weaving pattern. And so at some point, what I like to do is go around the edges with just some basic stitches, and this helps hide any of those little edges of your 5-point star that might still be sticking out. I think this is a nice way to finish roses off. It adds a little volume to the edges, and I think it's a nice finishing touch. So as you might have guessed by what I drew on these jeans, I do end up doing a total of 3 roses in this little spot. I think clusters of roses just look really nice together, and we'll see I like having the little leaves poke out in different directions as well. So for these leaves, I'm using this dark but brighter shade of green. I'm going to be doing what I would consider a true leaf stitch. So I'm going to start with a simple back stitch that doesn't quite touch the rose that I want. And then on one side of it, I'm going to push my needle through right next to that original stitch and push it through beneath it. So it's going to start on one side and sort of cross over to the center. I'm going to repeat that process on the other side of that center stitch. And as you can see, we start to see that leaf pattern take shape, where you can see the sort of crisscrossing. So basically, we're just going to be repeating this pattern as we move towards the rose itself, and that creates that crisscross pattern that makes it look more like a leaf. Our next flower is probably one of the easiest ones in this design. It's really just back stitching to a center point and doing either 4 stitches or 5 stitches depending on what you think looks best. So to explain that a little bit more, I'm pushing my needle through at the point furthest away from what would be the center of the flower, and then I'll push it back through at that middle point, and that's going to create those little lines, and then you can do about 4 or 5 of those to create the little flower. And then I'm just going to repeat this a bunch to create a little patch of these sort of wildflowers or daisies. You could potentially add a small French knot at the center of these as well, but I don't do that for this design. Next, we're just adding a little bit of greenery with some lazy daisy stitches and some simple back stitches to create that stem, and the lazy daisy stitches to create our little leaves there. One of the challenges with this specific project is how close I'm working to the distressed part of these jeans. As you've seen, these little threads and things keep getting in the way as I'm stitching. So if you're a beginner and you've never embroidered jeans before, I would recommend doing just regular non-distressed jeans, even though I think something like this can look really nice next to the distress, and that was sort of the point of this project. I would say it was challenging enough that I wouldn't recommend it to a beginner. It just adds some complicatedness that you don't really need if you're just trying to learn. So our next flower, we're using this medium shade cream. I believe this is the same color that I used on the tulips. We're using that in combination with a little bit of a darker green that I don't think we've used yet in this design. So for the stem, I'm doing the simple back stitching technique that we've been over quite a few times already. And then for the leaves, again, I'm going to start at the point, and then we're going to go to about the center of the leaf, closer to the stem than the true center of what I have drawn here. Then I'm going to push my needle through on one side of that first stitch and push it in just below that first stitch. So it's going to go to that center point, and we're going to make a little bit of a crisscross. It's just more elongated than it was for, say, the rose leaves that we did. So for the actual flowers, I'm going to be using a series of French knot to create a delphinium, which is a sort of stacked flower that has a long stem with flowers along the side of it. But we're going to be using French knots. Again, I'm wrapping twice. I'll do a mixture of wrapping once and wrapping twice to create those different sizes. As we get closer to the top of this flower, I'll start using smaller knots and use larger ones at the base. So now you can see our two finished delphiniums. We're going to get started on the other side of our distressed here, and I'm going to be using some lazy daisy stitches to create a sort of daisy-like flower. So as you can see, I start to really run into some distressed threads here, and honestly I had a lot of struggles creating these two flowers, and so I ended up doing a good amount of it off camera, but I do have some parts of it to share with you, and hopefully they will make sense. But I was getting very frustrated with the distress of these jeans. As you can see, it was very tangled in the back particularly. I ended up having to cut some of these distress threads because there was just no way to save them. So we're going to jump ahead here to when the flower is mostly finished. So as I said, it's not a true lazy daisy that I'm creating. I'm sort of filling in where the lazy daisy stitches had marked out petals. And then for the center, I'm not going to do French knots. I'm going to do sort of satin stitches basically to create that center. For the petals themselves, I'll start with a lazy daisy stitch and then stitch from the center of the flower over the top of that lazy daisy stitch towards the tip of the petal. And I'll do this about 2 to 4 times, however many I think is needed to create that nicely filled in petal. For the leaves of these flowers, I'm using the same color that I used for the tulip stems and leaves, the sort of lighter darkish green. And then for these leaves, I'm doing a classic leaf stitch, the exact same process that I showed for creating the leaves when we made the roses. The next part of this design is going to be tackling this large vine on top of the distressed hole in these jeans. So to start, I'm going to use this brightish green that we've actually used before on the leaves of the roses. So I'm starting with some simple back stitching as always to sort of create the base of this vine, but it is going to be a little bit more complicated as you will see. So I'm actually going to take the dark green that I used on the original baby's breath flowers that we started with, and I'm going to wrap it around the stitches that we just created with the brighter green. So I'm going to pull my needle through at one end of this vine and then slide my needle underneath one of the stitches and pull it through, and then loop it around to slide my needle underneath the next stitch. As I go, you'll be able to see that this creates a nice sort of striping pattern along the vine. I like to do this because it adds a little bit of depth, a little bit of difference in color here, which I think adds to the overall look. So this large vine is going to be a vine of white wisteria. Wisteria is one of my most favorite flowers, and so I was really excited to get started on this part. I've done another pair of embroidered jeans before, and for those I did the classic purple wisteria, but I've always really wanted to do the white wisteria. I think there's something very classy and elegant about it. So to create these flowers, I'm using a bright white, the same white that I used on the baby's breath, and again we are using the French knot. For these, so the flowers that are on or closer to the vine, those are going to be 2 wrap French knots. Otherwise, as we get closer to the bottom of the wisteria, or as it gets further away from the vine and droops down, those are going to be made from single wrap French knots. So now that my wisteria flowers are done, I'm just going to go in and add a few different leaves, and using that modified leaf stitch or classic leaf stitch to create them. I wanted to keep these fairly small, and I'm using the brighter green instead of the dark green to do so. So one of the last elements of this design, I'm doing another one of these stem and leaves in the light bright green that I did on the opposite side, doing back stitching for the stem and then some lazy daisy stitches to create the leaves. To fully finish off this design, I decided to improv a little bit and add a few of those white simple flowers that are just made of the 5 different stitches reaching the center point, using the bright white that I used on the wisteria and the baby's breath. I did these in little groups of 3. I thought they looked really cute this way, and this was just adding a nice finishing touch to the design. And here is the final product. This is the effort of a few days of embroidery work, and of course, here is what the jeans look like when I'm wearing them. If you stuck around to this point of the video, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm hoping to make more videos like this, so if you're into that, please subscribe. Okay, bye!